Greetings from the International Studies Consortium of Georgia. I am Rajgopal Sashti, Executive Director of the consortium, headquartered at Reinhardt University in Metro Atlanta. Students and faculty members from consortium and other universities and colleges, thank you very much for registering and participating in our virtual Visiting Diplomat program. Before I introduce our featured speaker for the day, please permit me to say a few words. This program is jointly sponsored by the Indiana University Center for the Study of the Middle East, the Columbia University Middle East Institute, Reinhardt University, and our consortium. For this and for the generous support, I would like to thank both the universities for their kind contribution. May I also take this opportunity to thank President Mark Roberts, faculty members, and students at Reinhardt University for co-sponsoring this event. Next, I would like to request you to enter your first and last name and the school with which you are affiliated in the chat box. Also, please do not interrupt our presenter and wait until the question and answer period. Each of you can ask one question so that others will also have a chance to ask a question. We will take as many questions as possible. At the conclusion of the program, please take a few minutes to record your impressions in a few words as to how this program added value to your personal and professional life. As you may be aware, the main objective of the virtual Visiting Diplomat program is to have a direct impact on talented and accomplished students at consortium and other universities and colleges, and increase their knowledge and understanding regarding a country or a region or a global topic. Today, our presenter will talk about the Middle East and the United Nations. The focus of the 90-minute interactive program will be international and cross-cultural in nature. Visiting diplomats serve as presenters and resource persons for the program and will introduce the region and its social, cultural, and economic footprint in the United States in general and the Southeast in particular. As a part of the program, the featured presenter will share her professional career trajectory to stimulate you to be creative and innovative and encourage you to aspire and reach higher levels of leadership as you pursue your own academic and professional goals. The purpose of this program is to provide you with unique experiences and opportunities not available in a textbook or in a classroom setting. The ultimate goal is to assist you to acquire global competency skills and help you to adapt and succeed in a dynamic and highly interdependent global economy. Now, it is my great honor and privilege to introduce Ambassador Feisal Istrabadi at Indiana University. Ambassador Feisal Amin Rasool Al Istrabadi is the founding director of the Center for the Study of Middle East, a national resource center at Indiana University, Bloomington, where he is the Michael A. and Laurie Burns McRobbie Professor in Global Studies, Global Strategic Studies, and Professor in Central Eurasian Studies Department at the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies. He focuses his research on the process of building legal and political institutions in countries in transition from dictatorship to democracy, especially the emergence of the rule of law, constitutionalism, legitimacy, transitional justice, and the political and cultural factors that influence the process of democratization. He also publishes scholarly policy and opinion articles on a variety of security issues relating to the Middle East. His book, The Future of ISIS, Regional and International Implications, edited with Sumit Ganguly, was published by the Brookings Institution Press in the spring of 2018. His monograph on the trials of the previous leadership in Iraq, the Iraq Supreme Criminal Tribunal, National and International Dimensions, is under contract with Cambridge University Press with an expected publication in 2024. Ambassador Istrabadi is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. He is non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, D.C., and non-resident fellow in law at the Iraq Institute. He lectures often at universities and policy institutes and appears frequently in national and international media. From 2004 to 2010, Ambassador Istrabadi served as Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary and Deputy Permanent Representative of Iraq to the United Nations, on leave after 2007. Prior to his diplomatic appointment, he served as a legal advisor to the Iraqi Minister for Foreign Affairs during the negotiations for UN Security Council Resolution 1546 of June 8, 2004, which recognized the reassertion by Iraq of its sovereignty. He was also the principal legal drafter of Iraq's interim constitution, the law of administration of state of Iraq for the transitional period, before contributing to the reconstruction of Iraq. Ambassador Istrabadi was a practicing trial lawyer in the United States for 15 years, with approximately 70 civil trials in federal and state courts, focusing on civil rights, employment discrimination, and constitutional torts. Now it is my great honor and privilege to request Ambassador Istrabadi to take over. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for taking time from your busy schedule to join us.
Thank you, sir, for that very generous introduction. And it is a great pleasure to see you again, a great pleasure to be a collaborator with you on a variety of projects. And this is certainly one of the more exciting ones, I think, and we're delighted that the Center for the Study of the Middle East can assist in facilitating these important discussions, and I'm delighted to be with you all. I look forward to engaging you in a conversation. I am going to talk, I'm going to talk a little bit, not so much about my personal experiences, although I will throw some of that in, but I'm happy to answer any questions about that during the question and answer period. But I do have a bit of a theme that I'd like to talk about, which I think is timely. So if I may begin by sharing my screen, and let's see if I can do that. And what I want to do is...
We can see your screen, sir.
Marvelous. Let me see if I can get it to work, however. Maybe what I need to do, bear with me a moment here. Let me do that and then bring this up. Oh, I see. Okay. I couldn't quite see what I was doing before. Now, let's try it again. Hopefully, I am sharing the right thing. Okay. So if everything is going well, there should be a title page of sort of U.S. diplomacy in the world. And what I want to do is to use the part of the world that I study and that I am originally from, although I'm from Iraq, not Iran. I'm going to talk about Iran, but not as a kind of thing in itself. What I hope to demonstrate by using this example is a larger proposition, which is that the United States may be the single most powerful country in the world still, militarily, politically, and economically, although on the latter point, China has been knocking on the door for some time. But the point is, regardless of the power of the United States, and regardless of the influence of the United States, it cannot go it alone on those matters that it regards as being in its vital national security interest, that it benefits from the international system, and that it more than benefits, it needs the buy-in of at least a certain, let's say, critical mass of allies. Now, for those who may study international relations, take political science courses, you might be familiar with different schools of thought about, different theories of international relations. Realists, liberals, and constructivists, for instance. These are the categories that political scientists categorize the three predominant theories of international relations in. Even dyed-in-the-wool realists who think that the only thing, the only motivation that states have in their international relations is trying to increase their power or to maintain their power, that states are not motivated by ideals or the rule of law, the international rule of law, or the sort of the rules of the game in the international system, that they're purely motivated by the conceptions of their own state power, and how to use that power, how to preserve that power in what is called a zero-sum game. That is to say, if you rise in power, it must be that I have diminished in power, because the sum total of the two equals zero. Now, that's the realist school. There are competing schools that disagree with that school, but let's look at it even from that very narrow perspective, one that rejects things, institutions like the United Nations and international law, or if not rejects it, at least thinks that those institutions are secondary in importance to just raw power politics. So let's just focus on that. Even that school understands that the most powerful states, and when they say things like the most powerful states, they mean states like the United States, need to have allies for certain things. Even when the most powerful states get into wars, for instance, they say they need to have buy-in even from people who are vanquished, who cannot sort of resist that power that great states can wield. Now, that's sort of my theme. And what I want to demonstrate is that although the United States has been the principal beneficiary of the international system in which the world has been operating since the end of the Second World War, it still needs allies. And let me here just go off first on a tangent and say that the United States is the principal beneficiary of the international system that that was created after the Second World War and that we still live in, is not an accident. The reason the United States is the principal beneficiary of it is because the United States was the principal architect of the system that we live in. It created the institutions that govern international relations by and large since the beginning of since the end of the Second World War, since 1945. That includes the political system as represented, say, in the existence of institutions like the United Nations, and it includes the economic system, which was represented initially by the Dumbarton-Oaks Agreement. The political system was the Bretton Woods Agreement. Both of these are areas in Washington, D.C., so you can see who's the driving force behind both Dumbarton-Oaks and Bretton Woods. It's obviously the United States that leads to the creation, in the case of Bretton Woods, the United Nations system, and in the case of Dumbarton-Oaks, what's called initially the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, which regulates trade in the international system, and then is now evolved into the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which again, the United States dominates And as a part of that system, there's also something called the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and one is dominated by the United States, the other is dominated by the United States allies, principally in Western Europe. And so the point is that my saying that the United States has been the principal beneficiary of the system that we live in is not an accident. It was designed to be that way. And one of the benefits that we derive from the economic system, for instance, is that the currency of international commerce is the dollar. The same dollar you've got in your wallets now is the dollar that is used in international currency, I beg your pardon, in international trade. And at some point, if you are, let us suppose we are, the currency in Iraq is called the dinar. So let us suppose that you are a corporation in, pick your country, let's say in Europe somewhere that uses the euro. But you want to do business with Iraq. Say you want to buy oil from Iraq. If we are doing an electronic transfer between, say, you're in I don't know, Belgium, use the euro, you're in Belgium, and you want to buy oil from Iraq. At some point, even though you use the euro in your country and I use the dinar in my country, at some point, as you're transferring the cost of the oil from to you, as you're paying my bill, you're going to transfer from euros to dinars. If you're doing an electronic transfer, which is how most international commerce is done, at some point, that transaction is going to take place in the US dollar. Your euro, as you're trying to transfer it electronically from your bank in Europe to my bank in Iraq, that whatever the price of the contract is in euro is going to be based on the exchange rate, transferred to the US dollar somewhere up here in the cloud, and then it will be transferred into Iraqi dinars when it hits my bank account. And that's the power of the US dollar. And actually, it's the power of the United States, a point that I'll come back to. The United States derives tremendous economic and political benefit from the fact that international trade, that electronic transactions, which are 90 some odd percent, if not very close to 100% of how international commerce is done, all at some point gets done in the US dollar, which means the US can control the entire system. Why? Because the dollar is our currency in the United States. So that's an example of how the United States benefits, and that's actually a point that I'll return to. Now, so let me see if I can get this to move forward. So this is a picture I often use. I'm hoping that I'm on to the next slide. This is a picture I often use in my talks when I talk about issues that are akin to this one. And it's actually a picture of a meeting between the then President of the United States, Donald Trump, and America's closest allies. These are the West European states and Japan. These are America's closest allies. They are the liberal democracies, as the United States is a liberal democracy in the Burkean sense of that word. These are America's closest allies. And yet, if you look at the body language, you can see that the United States is on one side, the Europeans are all on the other side, and Japan's in the middle, being neutral, which really, it's a great picture, because it would take 1,000 words to describe exactly what's going on here. You can see this skeptical look on President Trump's face. You can see this is John Bolton, who is the National Security Advisor. when this photograph was taken. This is a man I happen to know personally because we served at the same time at the United Nations. And you can see a kind of almost a scowl on Bolton's face, although that was to me a bit surprising. He tends to be very solicitous with US allies, but you can see the confrontational pose. This is Angela Merkel, who was at the time the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. And here behind her, this is the French, well, here you can just see his nose and maybe sort of half his face. That's the French president. And this is the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom at the time. But you can see the confrontational pose between the United States and its closest allies. Everybody on this side of the table is a NATO ally of the United States. And Japan, while not a NATO ally, has nevertheless been one of America's closest allies. And as between Germany and Japan, these are two states, of course, that the United States defeated in the Second World War, devastated, used 2 nuclear or atomic bombs on Japan, devastating 2 Japanese cities. But these 2 countries became America's closest allies, inseparable, in lockstep with the United States during the Cold War, when the world was dominated by the United States on one hand and the Soviet Union on the other. And yet here you have this photograph of obvious discord between the United States. And again, I'm sorry, I've said the word 3 or 4, or the phrase 3 or 4 times. I'm going to use it again. America's closest allies. And that's because the Trump doctrine, and in another talk I've given, I go into quite a bit of detail about this. The Trump doctrine was America first. So in other words, it was not a doctrine in which the United States felt compelled to go along with the allies, or more accurately, to bring along the allies to do what it wanted. And if it couldn't, then to moderate its stand so that it could maintain a unified stance with its allies. And the real point I want to make here is that the United States is strongest when it doesn't go alone, when it brings the allies along, when it can either convince them of the rightness of the policies it wants to make, that it wants, or at least that it, works out a compromise. Works out a compromise in its policy so that everybody can be on board. And I'm going to demonstrate that with an example from the Middle East, which is has been very much in the news actually for years now. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. So here, by the way, just so that we all have a picture of the part of the world I'm talking about, this is the Middle East, or West Asia, as the more accurately, I should say, the Indian Foreign Ministry calls it. There's a Department of West Asian Affairs, and that's what is called West Asia is the Middle East, or what the U.S. State Department calls the Near East. It's the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs at the U.S. State Department. But here you can see this is the Mediterranean Sea. This is Egypt, Israel, and Palestine, and Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. This is Turkey. This is Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and this is Iran. The Caspian Sea is here, and Afghanistan is here, and just sort of on the very sort of the easternmost part of this map, that is right here, that is Pakistan. Here you have the Indian Ocean, and of course here is the Persian Gulf. Although as a director of the Center for the Study of the Middle East, I'm more likely to call it the Arabian Gulf, but as a professor in Central Eurasian Studies, I have to call it the Persian Gulf. So depends which hat I'm wearing. But in any case, so there we are. The Suez Canal is right here. This is the Red Sea, and the Suez Canal is right here. So this just gives you an idea of where we are. I don't really use PowerPoints much, but this is helpful because there's some technical details, but I always like to use maps so we know the part of the world. And what I'm going to be talking about is US policy towards Iran with respect to one issue. And those of you that follow the news will, oops, there we go. And those of you that follow the news will probably already know that I am talking about the Iran nuclear agreement. Now, the nuclear agreement, so let me give a little bit of background. Iran began its nuclear program back in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And if I were to ask you, which country do you suppose helped Iran found its nuclear program, you probably might guess, if you didn't already know, the United States of America. And if you guessed that, you would be absolutely right. There was something in the Eisenhower administration called the Atoms for Peace program in the 1950s. Iran and Iraq, which had a different, which was a monarchy at the time. Both countries were monarchies at the time. Both were allied with the United States at the time, were a part of this Atoms for Peace program. And the genesis, the early incarnation, the early beginning of the nuclear programs in both countries goes back to the United States. And in the case of Iraq, I know I have a personal connection to that because my late father, who was a civil engineer, his field was structures and soil mechanics. His PhD was from the University of Michigan. In 1958, was actually in the United States, getting training in the, I believe it was the Argonne National Lab outside Chicago, getting training in the design and maintenance of nuclear power plants when the coup that overthrew the Iraqi monarchy took place. Members of my family were killed in that coup, but he found about it by reading it in the in American newspapers. So I sort of have a personal connection to the Atoms for Peace program. Anyway, that aside, the nuclear agreement with Iran, which is now a very different Iran. It's no longer the empire of Iran. It is now the Islamic Republic of Iran. Since 1979, the monarchy in Iran was overthrown, and a government generally hostile to the United States, and that the United States has generally been hostile to, has been in power ever since 1979. How hostile kind of goes up and down over the decades, but generally hostile. Tense relations between the countries. Iran has been under US sanctions for a variety of reasons that I don't have time to get into since 1979, more or less, or 1980. And again, if I were to ask, what is the one thing you might know about Iran that other than what is in the news today, it's possible that at least some of you will recall that back in 1980, Iran actually, there was a US embassy in the capital of Iran, Tehran, and the some Iranian students pushed by the new government in Iran took the US diplomats in the embassy hostage. That actually had an effect on the US election, probably. It caused the defeat of the incumbent president at the time, Jimmy Carter, and Ronald Reagan was elected president. And to make a point, the hostages were released within an hour of Ronald Reagan being inaugurated on the 20th of January, 1981. That's ancient history, comparatively speaking, although Iran does really have an ancient history, but that's comparatively speaking ancient history. By the time you get to the Obama administration, Iran is very clearly on a path towards creating, remember, the nuclear program that the US and France helped to establish in Iran by the 2013, 14, actually before that, by the George W. Bush administration. It was very clear that Iran was progressing toward mastering the technology of creating nuclear weapons. Now, I'm choosing my words very carefully, because mastering the technology for creating nuclear weapons and creating and stockpiling nuclear weapons are two very different things. The known nuclear states in the world are the 5 permanent members of the Security Council: the United States, United Kingdom, France, China, and the Russian Federation. There are other known nuclear states in the world. India is one, Pakistan is another, North Korea is another, and Israel is another. I believe those are the 9 known nuclear states. But there are other states in the world that experts, I'll say know that have actually mastered the technology. They just haven't gone to the last step of actually making nuclear weapons. For instance, no expert in nuclear proliferation believes that the technology is beyond Japan or South Korea or Germany, or, believe it or not, the Netherlands. But none of those states have taken the next step to actually make the weapons. And they're two very different categories of steps in how to make the weapon. One is to master the ability to make something go boom, right? A big boom. The other is to weaponize it. It's one thing to be able to make a device that can create a nuclear explosion in an underground test facility or in the desert somewhere. It's another to actually be able to make it into a weapon that can land where you want it to. Those are two very different technologies. Iran absolutely has developed the technology, the missile and guidance technology, because it's the same technology that is required to launch satellites. And that it can do. Whether it has the ability to make a bomb small enough to fit on a missile, the answer is probably no. And in any event, it has not yet made a bomb. George W. Bush attempted to negotiate with the Iranians to prevent them from being able to make a bomb. But in the end, Bush walked away, the United States walked away from signing an agreement. The Obama administration tried again, and in 2014, it signed what's called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. And the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action doesn't prevent Iran from ever getting a nuclear weapon, but it puts Iran under a strict regime of inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is a UN subsidiary body, and it delays for a period of time when Iran can develop a weapon. Now, I want to go a little faster here. The terms of the agreement in rough, I mean, the agreement's about 150 pages long with appendices, maybe a little longer than that, but in broad outline, the agreement is every country in the world under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which seeks to regulate the proliferation, seeks to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Every country has the right to enrich uranium to a certain point, about 3.5% for medical purposes and research. In Iran, when they signed the JCPOA with the United States, with the 5 permanent members plus Germany, it was the P5 plus 1 on one side and Iran on the other, the one being Germany. The Iranians agreed to reduce the number of centrifuges they had from 16,000 to 6,000, which is a fairly substantial cut, not quite a third. down to a third. And to reduce the amount of enriched uranium. You see, uranium in nature, when you mine it, is very low enriched. You have to keep enriching it. And one way to do it is to keep spinning it in centrifuges. And the more you spin, the more concentrated it becomes, and you can repeat. So you take out the more concentrated sample, centrifuge it again, and it becomes even more concentrated, and you can keep doing that. Up to about 3.5% is the limit of the legitimate civilian uses. To make a sufficiently enriched uranium to make a bomb, you have to be well in excess of 90%. And the critical step is getting to 20%. The hardest technological step is getting from something close to zero enrichment to 20%. Now, also, of course, the amount, the mass of uranium that you can store matters. That tells you how many bombs you can make. So the amount of enriched uranium that Iran started with 10,000 kilograms, which is 22,000 pounds. And it, under the terms of the agreement, the JCPOA, it could only keep 300 kilograms, which is 660 pounds, not 22,000 pounds, but 660 pounds. And the rest of it was shipped to the Russian Federation, which has its own nuclear program and is a known nuclear power. And that increased the time that it would take Iran from an estimated 1 year to 10 years. Okay. One of the heavy water reactors, that's what DTO is, it's heavy water. I won't take the time to explain that, was redesigned completely. The spent fuel was shipped out of Iran, again to the Russian Federation, and that put a stop to the ability of the Iranians to build a plutonium weapon. You could make nuclear weapons or atomic weapons with either uranium or plutonium, and this cut off the ability of the Iranians to make a plutonium weapon ever. And there was a comprehensive set of agreements with the Iranians about verification of the steps they had undertaken. They had to adhere to the additional protocol, to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There was a strict regime of International Atomic Energy Agency surveillance and inspections on site, and a strict monitoring of procurement channels of incoming into Iran. In exchange for all of that, the Iranians got certain relief from sanctions that the United States had imposed on Iran with the cooperation and collaboration of the Security Council at the United Nations and the European allies and Japan and other allies to make sure that Iran didn't acquire the technology needed to get nuclear weapons. When JCPOA was signed and agreed to by the 5 permanent members plus Japan and Iran, the agreement was that the sanctions that had been imposed on Iran would gradually be lessened. In the meantime, under US law, the administration had to report to Congress about whether or not Iran was in compliance of the JCPOA as the sanctions were coming off. And the sanctions included the ability of the United States to tell even countries that didn't have their own sanctions on Iran not to do business with Iran, because unless they bartered with Iran for goods in exchange, say, for oil, they couldn't do business with Iran because the US cut Iran off from this international exchange mechanism that involves at some point everything being converted into the dollar. That's the power of the United States and the economic system. Well, those kinds of sanctions were eased, and countries, including American corporations, could do business with Iran again. And so it went for a number of years until the Trump administration came to power. And at some point in May of 2018, the President of the United States, if I can manage to do this without screwing it all up, and let's see if it works. The President of the United States in May of 2018 made this announcement.
In just a short period of time, the world's leading state sponsor of terror will be on the cusp of acquiring the world's most dangerous weapons.
Let me pause here to say that from 2017 until May of 2018, the Trump administration every 3 months verified to Congress that Iran was abiding by the agreement, that Iran was not violating the agreement, and all of the major allies' intelligence agencies agreed with the American intelligence assessment that Iran was in compliance with JCPOA when President Trump made this announcement.
Therefore, I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
Therefore, I announce that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. That's the JCPOA.
In a few moments, I will sign a presidential memorandum to begin reinstating U.S. nuclear sanctions on the Iranian regime. We will be instituting the highest level of economic sanction. Today's action sends a critical message. The United States no longer makes empty threats. When I make promises, I keep them.
Okay, now let me turn this off so that I don't get.
We were fierce competitors.
Hang on. There we go. And let me get out of this so it doesn't keep. Okay. So, the United States in May announces a withdrawal. The problem the US has is that the announced withdrawal was opposed by America's closest allies, those countries in the photograph I showed, the European allies, the NATO allies, Canada, all the countries of the world opposed the United States unilaterally withdrawing. Why? Because Iran was in compliance. So, that put the United States by itself against its closest allies. Now, fast forward 2 years, and I'm going to end with this because I don't want to monopolize the time and I want to have time. I see questions are coming, but I'm going to end with this because this is the kicker here. This is the proof. This is the payoff. I've been telling a long story to get to this punchline, only it's not particularly funny. Fast forward 2 years, from May of 2018, a little more than 2 years, to the fall, August, September of 2020, just before the US election. No other country has gone along with the United States, although some have been forced to stop trading with Iran because of what are called secondary sanctions. That is the ability of the United States to sanction companies that do business with Iran because of this dollar exchange mechanism. So even countries that didn't impose their own sanctions again had to go along with the sanctions because otherwise their own companies couldn't do business with the United States or with the US dollar. But now the JCPOA is still working. At least parts of it are still working. Some sanctions are still coming off. And all of a sudden, the US realizes, oops, in October of 2020, just before the US election, sanctions that had been imposed on Iran because of its nuclear agreement that forbade other countries, all countries, from trading in conventional weapons, selling conventional weapons with Iran. Those sanctions are about to come off because the sanctions didn't all come off at one time. They came off slowly over the course of years. Now remember, Iran was in compliance. The US got out of compliance with JCPOA when it withdrew. But when it saw this deadline of October 2020 coming, the US got frantic. It had negotiated an agreement that as it was part of the JCPOA, that if Iran ever violated the terms of JCPOA, as the sanctions were being removed, if it ever came to light that Iran was violating its part of the bargain, and I gave you the thumbnail sketch of what it agreed to, the sanctions were the international sanctions that the Security Council had previously imposed, but that had fallen to the side over time, would snap back automatically, so that you wouldn't have to have another Security Council vote. Why did the US want that? The snapback automatically without a Security Council vote? Because in the Security Council, 5 countries have a veto. Russia and China are 2 of them. If you don't have a vote, you can't have a veto. So if Iran goes out of compliance, sanctions come back automatically without another Security Council vote. The problem is Iran wasn't out of compliance. The US was out of compliance. So in October of 2020, when the US convened a meeting or asked for the convention of a meeting of the Security Council, it had to argue that although it had withdrawn from the JCPOA, it was still a party to the JCPOA. And that by then Iran had been moving forward with its nuclear agreement. Therefore, the US argued it was no longer in compliance. We need to snap back those conventional weapons sanctions so that it couldn't acquire conventional weapons. Well, at the Security Council, which has 15 members, there was a vote on that question. Should the sanctions snap back? Because no one had said that Iran was in violation until the US became in violation. Only 2 countries out of 15 voted the way the United States wanted the rest of the council to vote. One was the United States, the other was Honduras. America's closest allies, the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, where NATO is headquartered, did not vote with the United States. They abstained, and Russia and China voted no, which would have been a veto anyway. My point is this: by taking the United States so out of step with the rest of the world, the whole world agrees, outside Iran, no one wants Iran to have nuclear weapons. The Russians don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, neither do the Chinese, and I know that from having been an ambassador at the United Nations. But the US took itself so far away from the rest of the world that it could no longer bring the world along on a specific policy, even though the strategic goal is shared by all those countries. The US cannot go it alone. It needs the world. The world needs the US. Madeleine Albright, when she was Secretary of State, first woman Secretary of State in the US, said the US is the indispensable country, and it is. But that doesn't mean that the US can go it alone. This was a strategic failure for the United States. And I'll end by saying this. In the past week, it was announced that Iran has hit the 80% threshold of enrichment. It's on its way soon of getting above 90%. We are much closer to the day when we wake up to a world that Iran is a nuclear power. And a part of the reason for that is the US went it alone. Instead of bringing the allies along to negotiate a better deal with Iran, to try to convince Iran with sticks and carrots that it could get a better deal than JCPOA. For everyone concerned, the US acted alone, and then it lost credibility because it became the party in breach, not Iran. It was a strategic blunder, in my view, of the First Order. That's why the US cannot go it alone. Yes, the world needs the United States, but the United States also needs allies, no matter how powerful a state it is. And I'm sorry, that's a long way to get to that bottom line, but I think the illustration is a really important one. And with that, let's start our dialogue. Thank you very much for listening.
Mr. Ambassador, can you hear me, sir?
I can, yes, sir.
Very good. We want to thank you for a very insightful presentation and a very unique presentation. It is always important to get an authentic and a different perspective, although we may or may not agree with it, but you have given that perspective and we really appreciate it. I don't know which approach you would like to take. There are several questions in the chat box, or we can ask people to put up their hand and ask the question.
I'll be happy to be guided by you.
Okay, Carl, can you unmute people so that we can see who is asking the question and people can ask the question? Are you guys ready for it?
Yeah, folks can unmute themselves. So if they just raise their hand, we can call on them and they can unmute themselves.
Very good. And if nobody comes up, I will read the questions from the chat box.
Some of the people who sent a question are welcome to raise their hand and actually ask it.
This is your chance to get as close to the ambassador as possible. There is a question, sir. Do you take into account, what's the question there? Let me see what. I think that question disappeared just now. Let me see if I can pull, yeah.
I think you froze.
Yeah, that question came up and then suddenly it disappeared. Hold on 1 minute.
Well, I can read the questions anyway.
Yeah, please, go ahead, sir.
So, I guess the first one that I'll address is, well, let me just take them in order. I'm just looking at the chat, what would the world look like if the US did not have military power as we do? What I'll say is this, and I say this as a former diplomat and now as an academic, and somebody who's interested in policy analysis. The one time the United States gets criticized more than for when it intervenes in a place is when it doesn't intervene. So as much as it gets criticized for intervening, and you can define intervention any way you want to, not just in military terms, when it doesn't intervene, and there's some, say, humanitarian catastrophe going on, whether man-made or natural, then the US gets criticized even more for that. My own view is that the United States as a military power has been on balance, on net, a positive in world affairs. That's in the eye of the beholder. I want to agree that some of what I said is in my talk is objective fact. My analysis that it was a strategic blunder, of course, is my opinion, and that you can disagree with. But so you can disagree with this. The U.S. has done things that it shouldn't have done, but on balance, on the whole, it has the fact that the United States has been a leading world military power has been a net benefit, I believe, to the world. It's certainly been a benefit to the United States, but I think that the world would have been a much worse off if the United States had not arisen to be the power that it is. Again, that's in the eye of the beholder. That's my personal view.
Here is another question. A major point of your presentation is essentially the importance of alliances. How do you as an ambassador work to encourage that kind of teamwork with people you directly encounter?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. And let me describe what the job of an ambassador is. The job of an ambassador is not to freelance. The job of an ambassador is to execute his country's policy or her country's policy as dictated through a chain of command that starts, I suppose, with a head of government or head of state, but comes down to the ambassador through the minister for foreign affairs. So it isn't, and I give you a real live example of that. I was the first ambassador who announced that Iraq had a one China policy. Believe it or not, people who know the Middle East kind of chuckle when I say that, because it sounds like an idiotic thing for Iraq to have had to do in 2004 when you consider China this great world power and Iraq. But I did because an Iraqi official traveled in an official capacity from the Kurdistan regional government to Taiwan. And that enraged the Chinese, and they insisted that we announce that we have a one China policy. Now, Taiwan has a population roughly the same as Iraq's. It has a democratically elected government. It seems to me, and as a professor in my personal capacity, that the residents of Taiwan have the right to self-determination and a right to decide whether or not they want to be a part of China. But I wasn't there to tell the world what I thought in my personal capacity. My foreign minister, because the Chinese asked us to make the statement, ordered me to make a statement that we regarded Taiwan as part of China. And I made the statement, even though I disagreed with every word I said, because that's my job. That was my job. I could resign, or I could do what I was told. I did what I was told because I didn't feel that strongly about it, given Iraq's problems. And that's what you do. So you don't have to like your colleagues, but if you're allies, you're going to get instructions from your two governments to say and do things at a place like the United Nations that are probably more likely than not going to be at least aligned, if not identical, and that's what you do. The real truth about being an ambassador is personally, privately, when the cameras aren't there, you get along with the diplomats from the countries your country doesn't get along with, but in public, you can't even acknowledge the other's presence.
Here is the next question, sir. Do you take into account that Iran is an enemy of the United States and was using funds from the nuclear deal to fund terrorism and using it to leverage influence in Iraq and Syria? My question is that, do you believe it's more dangerous to allow Iran to strike nuclear weapons or to use US NATO ally to fund terrorism and regime influence, blah, blah?
Well, I don't know how Iran is using NATO allies to fund terrorism. I don't understand. Because what it was actually doing was the other way. It was spending its money buying Airbus and Boeing jets, which would have gone into American coffers and European coffers. But be that as it may, yes, a certain amount of money was released to Iran. It was Iranian money, by the way. It wasn't like the U.S. made a payment. You know, people often misunderstand that. They think the U.S. taxpayer made a payment to the United States. These were Iranian assets frozen in the United States, which were then released. It is not a clear number. It's somewhere between 50 and 150 billion. The probable number is around 80 billion. In any event, that's not the question to me. Do I like what Iran does in Iraq? Absolutely not. Do I like what they do in Syria and other places and Lebanon? Absolutely not. I think it's atrocious. That wasn't the question. The question was, do we want Iran to have a nuclear weapon or don't we? That was the question. And if the answer to that is no, tell me how we get there. If the US could prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon militarily, I presume it would have done so already. It would have already struck Iran. The fact is, the experts, and I'm not an expert on hardware, but the experts say even the United States does not have the hardware to actually knock out Iran's nuclear program, because the Iranians learned from when Iraq had a nuclear program, which Israel struck, because everything was above ground. Israel flew some bombers, a couple of bombs go off. That's the end of the Iraqi nuclear program. Iran's nuclear program is all underground underneath mountains. And even the United States, which is the only country that has these bunker busting weapons that can penetrate doesn't think it has sufficient arms to actually bomb the nuclear program in Iran out of existence. So if you can't do that, your only other option was a negotiated settlement.
So here is the next question. How have relations between United States and Iran changed since the Trump administration withdrew from the nuclear deal? And how is the Biden administration attempting to improve these relations?
Well, the relations have not changed since the U.S. withdrew. The same sanctions, which Donald Trump correctly said were going to be the toughest set of sanctions ever imposed on Iran, those same sanctions are still in place today. Biden kept them in place. Biden did not remove the Trump sanctions. They've been trying to cajole the Iranians back into the deal, or at least some form of the deal. The problem is the Iranians have learned the game. That is that, okay, so I negotiate an agreement with the Biden administration. Well, 2 years from now, by the way, how do I know the Trump administration doesn't come back in, or another Republican administration, and doesn't do away with this deal? At this point, in my opinion, and this is my opinion, I don't believe Iran wants nuclear weapons to use against any of its neighbors. I believe at this point, if Iran wants nuclear weapons, it is to ensure that it is not attacked. This is what's called regime survival. Notice North Korea. Everybody was always saying, George W. Bush and predecessors and so on, that all options are on the table, which is a euphemism for we might bomb North Korea, until North Korea exploded its first nuclear weapon. And now nobody talks about bombing North Korea. Why? Because they can retaliate with nuclear weapons. And that's why I think if Iran wants nuclear weapons, and I believe they do, or at least they want, I'm convinced they at least want to master the technology, it's for regime survival, which made it even more important for the United States not to shed its allies. There's an old saying about, remember the people you meet on your way up the ladder, you'll meet them on the way back down. It's something like that, or treat them well because you'll meet them on the way back down. It's something like that. Similarly here, yes, the United States is the single most powerful country in the world, but it needed the allies to keep the sanctions in place, and it needed that united front of the whole world united against Iran. Once that was shattered, Iran was free to engage in diplomacy with the Russian Federation, with China. Right now, Iran is supplying arms to Russia in Ukraine. Think about that for a minute. This is a nuclear armed state having to buy drones and things from Iran, a developing country. It's a remarkable thing, but you have to give it to the Iranians. They've played a bad hand. They're much weaker than the United States, but they've played it really well.
What would be the impact if we stopped importing crude oil from Iraq? Would it potentially benefit or harm the US?
I'm sorry, was that Iran or Iraq?
Iraq.
Iraq. I'm not aware that the United States imports a lot of oil from Iraq. You can't just import oil from any country. I'm not an expert on oil, but I know this much. The refineries are built so that they can refine a certain type of oil. And I don't believe that American refineries can refine oil. It may be that the US imports so-called refined products, petroleum, gasoline rather, from countries that can refine Iraqi Iraqi oil. But it's a world market, so that a perturbation in one part of the market affects the US. The US is actually a net exporter of oil, even though we also import oil, again, because it's a world market and there's a kind of a seamless market. There's an international price. But if we, and so this has been one of the problems, is that we sanction countries. So if you don't buy Iranian oil, Well, you got to buy it from somewhere, and there's Mexico, there's Canada, there's US's own oil, although we also export, and there's Venezuela. And so that's a balancing. And again, energy experts think about this stuff all day long. That is not my expertise, so I probably shouldn't say much more about that.
Here is an economic question, sir. Oil prices have a major impact on individuals in the United States, and Iran and Iraq had record oil exports and high oil prices that allowed record oil revenues in 2022. Do you think the high oil revenues and exports will continue in 2023?
No is a short answer, and again, not because I'm an expert on oil markets. Most of Iran's oil now goes to India and China. Iran goes mostly to India and China. And with China, they've worked out barter agreements. So they send oil to China, and China sends back manufactured goods. Not quite sure how it works with India. It may be similar, but I'm not certain. Although I think India also gets exemptions from US sanctions from the United States. Iraq has had relatively record oil sales, but I will note that in the past week, Iraq has had a downturn in productivity. Iraq is a long way off from its theoretical maximum ability to pump oil. Unfortunately, in the last 20 years, we haven't made as much progress. I remember 20 years ago, and we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of the war in Iraq that overthrew the previous government in Iraq. We're coming up on the 20th anniversary on the 19th of March. At that time, there were predictions that Iraq would be 5, 6, 7 million barrels a day. We're nowhere near that. And I know that in the last week, it was reported that last month oil slumped in Iraq. So we seem to be having a difficult time in Iraq to increase productivity. That, of course, is having a major impact on Iraq's economy.
You are a diplomat, and you may want to give a diplomatic answer to this question. Do you feel like Trump being elected as president caused strife between United States and other countries that we may have been allies with before his election? If so, how have you seen that come to affect the United States international relations in the years since? Do you have any examples?
I do, and I will answer that because I'm not a diplomat anymore. So I get, being an academic, I get to say what I want to say, and I obviously don't represent anybody else's views. This is just my own view, and I can be wrong on any given topic. But yeah, you could see it, and I think that actually, no question that photograph tells you something. That I've never seen a photograph like that. Disapproval in diplomatic circles is usually expressed with a raised eyebrow. And absolute opprobrium or contempt is expressed in diplomatic language with the phrase, "That was not helpful." You never see the kind of posture in a diplomatic setting that I showed that Angela Merkel and Trump look like they're getting ready to come to blows. These are the two closest allies in the 50 years of the Cold War, and that absolutely had an effect. You had Donald Trump. Whether you think he was right or wrong is another story. That's up to you. That it affected him is an absolute fact when he started putting in doubt the notion that the United States would be there to defend the NATO allies. He put Article 5 in doubt. He started publicly saying the NATO was obsolete. He started saying things like, well, if a NATO country is attacked, we'd have to look to see if it spent enough on its defense, or whether or not we want to go to their defense. I mean, that put countries, it looked like, and you had Germany saying things like, well, maybe we need to create another international currency of trade other than the US dollar. Again, this is a close US ally. Whether you like those policies or not, Biden has reversed those policies. Russia's lawless invasion of Ukraine has given Biden the ability, and I must say, if you think rallying the NATO allies around the United States is a good thing, if you believe that. If you don't, then you'll think I'm wrong. But if you do think it's a good thing, and actually, whether you think it's a good thing or not, Biden was remarkably able quickly to rally the NATO allies to adopt his view of how the United States and the NATO allies should respond to the Russian Federation in Ukraine. And I don't know how quickly Biden would have been able to repair the breach, although he came into office saying that he would. But Russia gave the NATO allies the real impetus to once again work closely with the United States. How many of these sort of stretchings and contractions of the alliance, the NATO alliance can take, who knows? But that has certainly happened.
Mr. Ambassador, before I go to the next question, I want to request the audience to record their impressions and their comments so that we can have some kind of feedback coming back to you. But here is a very different kind of question from a lady. In USA, women are major contributors to our GDP. As a young woman getting ready to enter the workforce in the next couple of years, I'm curious to know your thoughts on women's role in growing Iraq's economy.
Forgive me, I'm going to tell you something about my own family. But let me take you back to 1953. Bear with me. In 1953, a woman named Sandra Day O'Connor graduated from the Stanford Law School. She was the salutatorian, the #2 graduate in the Stanford Law School. Stanford Law School was an elite law school then, and it's an elite law school now, one of the 8 or so most prestigious law schools in the country. The valedictorian of her class was a man named William Rehnquist. William Rehnquist went on to a brilliant legal career immediately after graduating from Stanford. In 1953, Sandra Day O'Connor could only get interviews to be a legal secretary. No one wanted to hire the #2 graduate of the Stanford Law School because she was a woman. In 1953, my mother's 2 older sisters were both professors of medicine at the University of Baghdad School of Medicine. My point in telling you that story is be careful about stereotypes. Women have been, my mother was a PhD from Indiana University, where I teach now, and was a professor. She wasn't a doctor, a medical doctor like her sisters, but she was a professor of Shakespearean drama. She was an authority on the translations of Shakespeare into Arabic. Women have been a part of the Iraqi workforce since my mother's generation. The first practicing lawyer in Iraq was my mother's first cousin. The first Muslim woman physician in Iraq was my mother's older sister, the 2 older sisters, the older of the 2. There was one Christian lady some years before my aunt who graduated from the University of Baghdad. At the time, it was called the Royal College of Medicine. Women have been my sister, my late sister was a professor here at Indiana University. She had her office was a few doors down from mine. Women have been a part of the Iraqi workforce. They've been doctors, lawyers, engineers in Iraq for a very long time, and they will continue to be so. Women have lost some rights in Iraq as against my mother's generation. That is a mistake, and that needs to be reformed. You cannot, as the question is right, Ms. Farese, you're absolutely right, that you cannot ignore half your workforce and then prosper. And I absolutely agree with that. And so while women have lost ground, there is a tremendous precedent amongst Iraqi women who led in my mother's generation, and my mother was one of them, the mass education of women in Iraq. And that is something that we very much hope will continue in the future.
Mr. Ambassador, there have not been any questions about Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu coming back into power? Would you have some thoughts to share with us? This is not somebody's question. This is my personal question.
Sure.
I have been reading other people's questions so far.
I have to say that it is difficult to be optimistic that there will be peace between Israel and Palestine while the Israelis keep electing right-wing governments and while the Palestinian leadership is sort of barely registering a heartbeat. Unfortunately, both sets of polities have settled into an unfortunate pattern of maintaining the status quo. I do not believe the status quo can be maintained indefinitely. There is a demographic reality that very soon, if not already, it may already have happened, but according to UN estimates from a few years ago, by 2035, which is only, sounds like a long time away, and the younger you are, the longer away you think it is. But for someone of my age and the professor's age, 12 years, not that
More
long
my age
now.
than your age.
Not that long from now. There will be more Arabs living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean than Israeli Jews. Remember, there are Israeli Arabs also. Israeli Arabs who are citizens of Israel, but are Arabs, are 22% or so of the population of the state of Israel. When you add the Arabs who live in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, put those two together by 2035, 2030 or 35, I can't remember, there will be there will be more than 50% of the population Arabs. If you can't make peace now under these circumstances, then this cycle of violence, of Palestinian violence, especially on settlers, on Israeli settlers, and Israeli settlers' violence on Palestinians will just continue. And unfortunately, I predict it'll, and this is not a hard prediction to make, it's just if you've been paying attention the last 50 years, there will be a continuing cycle of escalations between the two sides. Netanyahu, who succeeded what was already a far-right government, he's just, the government he formed is even farther to the right. But Netanyahu has said there will never be a Palestinian state while he's prime minister, which means that as the Palestinian population continues to increase, and the reason for that is they have higher birth rate than the Jewish population, then Israel has a choice. It can be a Jewish state or it can be a democracy. It can't be both. And that is the dilemma that faces the Israelis. Why the Israelis don't see that, I don't know. On the other hand, from the Palestinian side, there is every incentive to make peace and to actually build their country, invest in their country. The poverty in the Gaza Strip should frighten to death any rational Palestinian leader. It is the most densely populated strip of land on the globe. And the poverty there is that leads to radicalization is frightening. And the fact that you have two polities, the Palestinians on one side, the Israeli on the other, absolutely stuck, frozen in what is a recipe for disaster, is just mind-boggling to me. Again, these are my opinions, and I hope I'm wrong. Usually my negative predictions are correct. My hopes and expectations never come to fruition, but my negative predictions come to pass. And so I'm afraid that might be the case here.
I'm going to pause here, and before I thank you, because we will reach the 3:30 hour very soon, I want to see if anybody has any questions. Please put your hand up. Feel free to ask the question. We are not trying to control the questions that are coming in. But we are past the stage of you typing it in the chat box. You need to really come out and voice your question, please. Carl, can you unmute them if you don't mind?
Any participant should be able to unmute themselves.
Okay. Malik, to everyone, can you unmute yourself, sir, and ask the question? Mr. Malik? He can't hear me probably. Oh, it won't allow me to. Can you type your question in the chat box for the ambassador? Oh, Carl, they are saying it will not allow them to unmute themselves. Carl?
Can they raise their hands so that Carl can unmute them?
All right. I believe I've unmuted Malik.
Okay. Can you unmute everybody for a minute? We don't have really too much time before 3:30.
Sure.
All right, Mr. Malik, please. Something is not working. Hello?
Failing that, there's a Ruby Billamor.
Yeah,
Lamoria.
Yeah. Question, please. And Mr. Ambassador, you can read the question and then answer so that everybody can hear at least.
Are we trying to unmute Ruby?
I am trying. Give me one moment.
Carl, I thought there may be some way to unmute everybody at some point. I may be wrong, you know.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
go ahead.
My question was, do you think that Trump made a mistake when he was withdrawing from the JCPOA? And if there would have been if our economy could be in a different place, if he would have made a different decision?
I don't think the US economy is so much larger than the Iranian economy. I don't think that the JCPOA had any impact on the American economy. I did see somebody say, what effect did the sanctions have on the Iranian economy? It's devastated the Iranian economy. The sanctions have. I don't know what I just said. I may have said JCPOA. I meant the sanctions. Devastated the Iranian economy. But yes, I do think the United States made a mistake. And the fact is that in December or January, I think it was December of 2017, an institute, it's the IISS, the International Institute of Strategic Studies, which is at Tel Aviv University, ran a simulation before the May 2018 video that I played with Trump announcing the withdrawal. The IISS at Tel Aviv University did a simulation with Rand Corporation where they brought in a number of actors and everybody played a country. And the simulation was the US withdraws from the JCPOA, what happens next? They ran the simulation 3 times. They ran it with different parameters, and every single one, as soon as the United States announced that it was withdrawing unilaterally from the agreement, the US lost all leverage. And in each of the simulations, Iran ends up with a nuclear weapon. And that, I think, is the trajectory we're on.
Did you actually do that?
Okay,
thank you so much for answering my question. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
We have time for one last question. And please, in the meantime, go ahead and record your reactions in the chat box because we're going to wrap this up. Ms. Purvis, question, please. Hello?
Are you
Jessica.
talking to me, Joy?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I don't have a question. It was a very informative session. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody with the last question? She says she has a howling dog.
Well, I have an Alaskan Malamute and she howls all the time too. So that's a good thing. I love dogs, so never apologize for a dog.
Okay. Malik, you have a question? Well, we are approaching the...
This is actually a good question from Malik, that Iraq has a massive amount of resources and a rich history that would promote tourism. What's holding them back as far as that's concerned, considering it should be a wealthy country? I'm paraphrasing the question. That's a really great question. When the price of oil was much lower than it is now, it's $20 a barrel. There were estimates that I saw that Iraq could double its income from tourism, double it, or that is to say, make as much money out of tourism as it was making from the sale of oil. There are two problems. One is that although Iraq should be a wealthy country, over the last 60 years, there has been very little investment inside the country because the previous government has took us into 3 major wars that just devastated Iraq. Then we were under international sanctions for 13 years after Iraq invaded Kuwait in one of those wars. And actually, although Iraq looks like it should be a wealthy country because of the resources it has, including, most importantly, it has some water at least, aside from oil, it actually, because of the lack of investment internally, is its economic problems internally are vast. The problems are vast, and it has a political class which just isn't up to the job. It has not been able to solve the political problems between the politicians so that they could focus on the economic development of the country. And it also, unfortunately, has one of the most corrupt governments in the world. And that also isn't going to help things like investing in the country, including in tourism. Otherwise, its potential for tourism is just spectacular with the ancient ruins and so on, the ancient civilizations that have been that existed in Iraq. It's a terrific question, but let me end there because I think I'm just about out of time.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, on behalf of the consortium, on behalf of the participants, we would like to thank you. This has been a very, very informative presentation.